Let's move on to survivorship curves. So what survivorship curves are they're plots on a graph of the number of individuals still alive at a particular age in the lifespan. So on this graph here, we see three different characteristic survivorship plots curved on the graph. And one is a type 1, which is characteristic of humans, long-lived organisms. Type 2, straight line, characteristic of some mammals. And then type 3 is basically the opposite of type 1, and that's characteristic of, this is an oyster. Also things like insects that produce many, many young that die relatively early. So species that exhibit the type 1 survivorship curve usually produce few offspring, give them good care, and that increases their likelihood that the offspring will survive until maturity. So let's think of humans. We have relatively few offspring, and generally, hopefully, right, we give them a lot of parental care, and then the offspring tend to survive until adulthood. Remember the life tables we looked at earlier. And then mortality, percentage of survivors, the mortality increases, meaning the survivors drop as we age. Okay? Now, the opposite of that, type 3 curve, there's a lot of mortality early in life, and that's characteristic of organisms that produce hundreds to thousands of offspring, like clams or insects. Most of them die early, and then the ones that do survive until adulthood usually live the longest. Or, better stated a better way, they have better survivorship once they get older. And then type 2 curve is right in the middle. The number of mortality, deaths, and the survivorship is fairly even, constant throughout the lifespan, and that's characteristic of smaller mammals. So, again, if you're an organism with type 3 survivorship curve, you have low survivorship of the very young, meaning most of them die, and then followed by high survivorship of the relatively few individuals as they age. Sometimes this is called survivorship strategy in terms of reproduction, of shotgun reproduction, in the sense of many, many, many individuals are produced because most of them die early, and that's the best way to ensure that you'll have some surviving till adulthood. So species that exhibit the type 2 curve, survivorship curve right here in the middle, have survivorship and mortality that's fairly constant over the lifespan. And again, the smaller mammals are characteristic of that. Things like reptiles, amphibians as well. So let's look at how life histories have correlated with evolutionary adaptations of organisms. So an organism's life history is the set of traits, characteristics that affect the organism's schedule of reproduction and survival. And it's different for different organisms based on their life histories. So population patterns of survivorship is an important feature of the life history of different organisms, different species. So key life history traits include things like the first age of reproduction, usually for organisms that are longer lived and are large. They don't get to be reproductive until they're fairly old. Like with humans, right? You can't reproduce until you're at least in your teens. So something like insects, some of them can reproduce after they're only days old or maybe weeks old. Okay? The number of offspring. Again, some longer lived larger organisms produce fairly few offspring. Organisms that are smaller and have a shorter lifespan tend to produce many, many offspring. And then the amount of care is variable and depends on the organism's life history strategies. Some organisms have an extensive amount of parental care. And again, larger organisms tend to have that, like whales and elephants and humans. And some shorter lived organisms that are smaller, some have no parental care, like many insects just lay their eggs and leave, and the offspring are totally on their own. So a combination of life history traits represents the trade-offs that balance the demands of reproduction and survival. It takes energy to survive, gain food, that sort of thing, resources, and it takes energy to reproduce and produce offspring by the females, and it takes energy to care for the offspring. So depending on the organism, how long it lives, often how large it is, will determine these trade-offs between the costs, the energetic costs of reproduction and survival. For some species, it works best, it's to their advantage to survive, to produce relatively few offspring and invest a lot of care in them. For other organisms, it's more beneficial to produce many offsprings and minimize the parental care. And then from other organisms, it's somewhere in the middle. Again, it's totally dependent on the organisms, the species, something that's often called species-specific life history strategies. So selective pressures vary, meaning those selective pressures in nature that favor few offspring, extensive parental care, or many offspring, minimal parental care, or somewhere in the middle. So life histories are very diverse, and these are, in a way, generalizations of few offsprings, extensive parental care, many offspring, minimal parental care. But in reality, there's kind of a gradation between these reproductive and survival strategies that will allow the different organisms to survive. Excuse me. So organisms with what are called opportunistic life history strategies take immediate advantage of favorable conditions because they are opportunistic, and they typically exhibit the type 3 survivorship curve, meaning many offspring reproduced relatively rapidly, often because these organisms can have a short lifespan, but then many of the individuals do not survive to reach adulthood. So many plants and insects and some mollusks like clams, oysters will reproduce this way. When environmental conditions are favorable, they'll grow, mature rapidly, produce many offspring. This is a dandelion, and each little helicopter, little parachute type thing, there's a seed and a distribution method, this little structure, and these seeds, meaning individuals in there, go off into the environment and hopefully will opportunistically take advantage of those resources and reproduce rapidly. Very few of them are going to survive, right? And that's characteristic of an opportunistic life history strategy. And again, they typically have type 3 survivorship curves. On the other end, and again, these are broad generalizations, but on the other end, organisms with equilibrial life history strategies develop and reach maturity relatively slowly. It takes a long time, often because they're big. Think of whales and elephants, humans, right? Other primates. We tend to produce few offspring, tend to devote a lot of parental care for them. And again, these organisms tend to be larger bodied and longer lived. And again, they have typically type 1 survivorship curve. The few individuals that are born tend to have high survivorship, low mortality early in life. They reach adulthood, and then they die off as they age, okay, in general. So here's a table that shows some basic life history characteristic of opportunistic and equilibrial species populations. Think of this as life history survivorship strategies. So, for example, let's look at climate and how that affects these organisms. If it's an opportunistic population, such as wildflowers or some insects, their life histories are relatively unpredictable, their numbers because the climate has a large effect on them. With equilibrial populations, like larger mammals, climatic changes are relatively have relatively predictable effects on their population numbers. Okay? Maturation time tend to be short, meaning they reach adulthood and reproduce relatively quickly. With the equilibrial populations, it's a long time. Lifespan relatively short versus a long lifespan. Death rate often high, usually low. Right? Look at those survivorship curves. Number of offspring produced, many versus few. Number of reproductions per lifetime, usually one, often several. Timing to first reproduction, early in lifespan, later in life. Size of offspring or eggs, small, so that allows for good distribution. And if you're going to produce hundreds to thousands of offspring, they're going to be small. Think of eggs or seeds. Or relatively large, with the larger lived organisms and the larger organisms. And then parental care, little to none or often extensive. Okay, so these basic generalizations of the opportunistic and or equilibrial organism species and or populations. So let's look at how population numbers change over time, meaning growth models, if you chart them out. So population sizes fluctuate as new individuals are born into populations or move into an area, think of migration, or move out of the area or die from a particular population. So that will cause these factors will cause increases and decreases in population over time, depending on when they're occurring and how drastic or large they may be. So population ecologists use models to investigate how the size of populations will change over time, their numbers, their densities, under different environmental conditions. Okay? Think of places that have severe winters. Population numbers can drop in the winter and then rise in the spring and summer, and that's characteristic of northern environments. Think of like Canada. So, excuse me, exponential population growth, that's one particular model that shows rapid growth. So if you graph this, if you've had an algebra class, this is an exponential growth curve. It would theoretically go up, 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 up through the roof. So what happens with exponential population growth in species, organisms, or in populations, it's the expansion of a population rapidly under conditions where there are ideal environmental conditions and or ideal unlimited resources, food, space, water, room, etc. So this is characteristic, this plot, of exponential population growth. And this can occur in nature under certain conditions. And as we'll see or talk about, this cannot continue indefinitely because the environment on a global scale is actually limited, but it can be unlimited in terms of resources for species, organisms for the short term. And we'll talk about conditions or situations where this might be the case, where you would see exponential growth curve or exponential population growth giving this type of growth curve when it's mapped. So next we'll see this little video on population ecology, and this will cover a good portion of the lecture on this chapter. And we'll do this on the next section.